I think that one of the concerns that people have is that we live in a framework that's kind of implicitly built around mind-body duality and assumes a certain privilege of people's thoughts, that those thoughts will only be known if they choose to express them, and that their mind is essentially a privileged entity that exists outside of the material world. It's not the practical viewpoint that neuroscientists operate under when they're physically working with the brain and trying to decode things. Yeah, a lot of neuroscientists probably have a kind of code that they live by every day and then a code that they use to scientifically interrogate the brain. But certainly when people are developing devices for the brain, they're doing it from a very materialist perspective. And so I think some of the anxiety that I can myself express, and I've certainly heard other places, is that neural data breaks that down a little bit, and there aren't enough existing structures in place for when you can kind of break through that barrier.
What time frame do you think we'll be able to break through that?
I think we're already there, to be totally honest with you. I don't know if Reardon is correct that you can fingerprint people based on their EMG signal, but certainly there will be data that is perhaps not interesting enough to drive the cyborg applications of the future, but is enough to identify if someone's predisposed to Parkinson's or other diseases. I think that you're going to find biomarkers, and I don't think that you're going to need new technology to do that. That's something that drives my personal curiosity in BCI ethics.
So that's really helpful, right? Because there's three different things to unpack there. So one is biomarker of disease, thought reading, and just like a fingerprint, so unique identification.
And I think thought reading isn't necessarily thought reading in the sense that grabbing a complete snapshot of one's consciousness, but simply perhaps even just being able to bin the state of mind into a convenient bin.
Which arguably, if you believe what EEG measures are supposed to be correlated with, you can do now.
For instance, you might be able to tell if an employee is not paying attention during a meeting. That's not exactly thought reading, but it's also data that employee might want to keep to themselves.
So for me, I'll say it's super helpful to actually break, because privacy is such a big word, and thoughts, these are all like such big concepts that it's really, and I think the considerations for each of the things you mentioned are worth talking about. And they're worth talking about in the context of the technologies that are being developed, because there's different technologies that are going to be able to get at each of those things in different ways, right? Are we coming at it from the medical space, the consumer space? What are we revealing, and what are the protections for those things? And where are they living? That when we go big into like thought protection and mind, I feel like that's not as helpful as like going, into concrete, what are the concerns in what context using which technology.
And that's actually what I'm really concerned about in current conversations, advocating about the uniqueness of neural data and that we need special regulations, that it really rests usually upon like hyped arguments about, an orientation towards mind reading. And I'm really worried about the damaging effects of that. I wish Nita Farahani was here, and I've been waiting for this paper to be published, and maybe it has and I just haven't found it, but she actually did research asking American populations about their perceptions of their data and how careful they thought they should be with their data, which kinds of data they cared about. And frankly, they didn't really seem to care uniquely about the neural data at all. It didn't explain why. It might be the case that they just didn't have a sense of what it was or what could be interpreted from it, but cared a lot about breaches that would let people know their social security number, their credit card numbers, their text messages. Those are the types of things that they were worried about. So I think that it's important to then link what like Anna was saying, the capability of those technologies with the types of things that are tangibly out there in the world that people are concerned about, and circumscribe within the ability of what those technologies can do now. The reason I still think that even early on we need to take extra care and consideration with neural technologies, though, is because it's just another technology that's apprehending a unique kind of information that will likely get better and not worse. And I think if you get in the habit of not worrying about it and just giving your information, all kinds of information all the time, and you think it's fun and don't really think about other implications, then I think that it can be damaging later, because we won't have seen the possibility of what could happen when you have more detailed information. And part of that is related to biosensing in the real world around predictive brain health and a number of things. Being able to use sensors and accelerometers and all kinds of data that people are actually freely sharing now through Apple Health agreements. Apple is turning into a health company, but it's just a fun thing, taking their steps and helping them lose weight or whatever else they think. I feel like there's not enough awareness and communication about the possibility of what those technologies are. And it may be the case that nobody cares too, you know. And I also suspect it's going to be different. In fact, this is what I study is culturally. And to your point of this mind, brain, body dualism, in fact, my research has shown that in fact scientists and doctors in neurology and psychiatry are really strong dualists in their practice and in the way they see patients and in how they stigmatize them too, and how they make assumptions about their care. So scientists aren't really different, even if they're on the nuts and bolts. Even those who profess that they are not that explicitly and have the vocabulary to say that will still in their work manifest in that way. So one of the things I was actually trying to do was interview for particular unique disease that I was working with. I was interviewing colleagues in East Asia who have a baseline philosophical historical orientation around oneness, and that is around the mind, brain, and spirit are actually one entity and inseparable. In fact, there's not even the vocabulary to suggest that they're separate. While I ended up landing mainly with professionals in the space that are working as neurologists, psychiatrists, or scientists, I really didn't get to move into talking to community. And what I learned though was that there is this kind of allegiance to Western ideology and training in medicine and science that's even eclipsing some of the traditional medicine offerings that a lot of these countries had. So there was being infiltrated with that kind of bias as well. It's interesting, but as far as the privacy bit though, that seems to be oriented not necessarily around just mind-body dualism or collectivism or individualism, but is actually more oriented around the history of those words. So privacy in Chinese and in Japanese, the original translation is shameful secret. So why would you need to have one? You know, whereas Western, trajectory of the definition has been one more about celebrating your ability to present yourself as you want, and that is considered something that later was called a right. I think as technology evolves on a global scale, those kinds of considerations will have to be put into place.
You brought up the idea of diverse perspectives on this. I'm curious if we can just quickly go around, and I'd be really curious to know what's the type of data that you feel particularly sensitive to that maybe a lot of your peers and other people that you meet don't feel as sensitive about. So I'll go first just to break the ice. On certain, not to target any particular company, certain social media sites, I am uncomfortable putting my daughter's faces because I don't like the idea of that technology company building a model for their face and identifying them and tagging them. And I want them to be able to grow up without that burden. But everyone in my family thinks that I'm a complete weirdo, and they're probably right. And I'm curious, do you have some data that you feel is close to you that's personal?
I would say even knowing what I know about the potential privacy implications, what scares me the most is how much I trade off my privacy for convenience with all my data. I know Alexa, about what's happening with the data. I mean, I know what the media knows, right? I'm sure there's a lot more going on with data from Alexa. I mean, I have a smart home. So I am concerned about all of my data, but I'm most concerned that I'm trading off that privacy for convenience, and I'm doing it knowingly and totally willingly.
Since I've started thinking about these issues, I've started reading EULAs, the end user license agreement. I don't know if people read these, but they're actually quite interesting. I bought a $30 activity tracker over the Christmas break and read the EULA, and it was pretty funny and enlightening. It said, if you log into the app, we'll probably share your data with our server, otherwise no. So I chose not to log in. And then it had this funny line like, if you are uncomfortable with our data practices, you should talk to the regulators. So it's unclear who the regulators are. But I've been approaching this in terms of, do I know what's going to happen with my data? And then I just make the choice after that.
I wanted to purchase a Roomba, but that was too expensive, so I got a knockoff. And there was an option to get a smart Roomba or a smart whatever it is, and I didn't get it because I was like, I don't want that thing responding and connected to the internet and all of that. But I will say in general, I think I'm a lot like, and just need to get through. There's this update on my computer. I just need to agree to it because what else am I I gonna do? As far as those privacy agreements, Stephen Schuler runs CyberGuide. He actually, and there's been a lot of conversation since then looking at privacy agreements in a lot of apps, and a lot of them are just cut and paste. They don't even apply to those new apps that are out there. But he scans a lot of them, and if you're interested in a mental health app, you can go to CyberGuide and get a sense of transparency and how those privacy agreements line up.
You three have so far given very interesting answers, but you've actually not answered the question that I asked. And maybe you don't feel comfortable, and that's fine too.
Matt, I would agree with you that I kind of hesitate every time I upload a picture in my Instagram or Facebook about my kids. So I do feel that this is not my life in a way, and that I'm okay, giving my face and my data away for convenience or whatever, but I'm very protective with my kids. So I don't share a lot of pictures of my kids.
Matt, to answer your question was what specific kind of data?
Is there something that's close to you? And particularly, like, there are things that are common to everyone. But is there something that's close to you that your friends would say, Anna, why are you being weird about this? Like, who cares? Just give them the data. I'm curious if there's something that you feel is tied up with, your identity or your situation that you like to hold close that other people don't care about as much. Because I think it's different for people. I think that's something Karen was saying that really resonates with me, is that this concept of privacy and private data and privileged data is not universal.
I think that in general, I am careful of the possibility, even if the possibility might be labeled, because even with agreements for certain kinds of information, it can easily be sold to the next company if the first one folds or different decisions happen. So I think that I'm kind of thinking about portals for information for me, and sometimes I'm more disciplined about not letting portals for information allowed. So I don't have a Nest, I don't have smart appliances.
Would you be comfortable with, just as an example, how about your voice? Has anyone watched the Little Mermaid? Cost of doing business for Ariel is she has to give her voice to the sea witch. What about voice recognition that builds a model of your voice and maybe could be used in a generative model, so that perhaps one day you're riding the bus and the person that tells you that the next stop is Charing Cross, you find that that's your voice. Would that feel personal to you?
There's a woman who recreated a deceased friend through old text messages and emails, and has an app now that one can use to speak to the dead in a way. And then there's that other Korean VR experience where the mother tragically lost her daughter young, and they recreated images of her and her voice through available information they had. I'm surprised we didn't get more buzz about that in the US, but if we had done that in the US, it would have been a lot more information. But in Korea, it was developed for a way for this woman to cope with the loss of her daughter. And had she not given all that information, she wouldn't have gotten the closure that she could have in that. And it was heartbreaking. I mean, in the video, her daughter tells her not to cry. It's a birthday party for her. I mean, I can't think of how more heartbreaking it could have been, but it's a birthday party for her deceased daughter, telling her mom not to cry and to let her go, And I was like, oh my God, would I want to have that experience? Would I want information like I guess I was thinking of your pictures of kids on the internet and videos that people share. Some people really want that and be grateful for something in that light. That's not like a marketing tool necessarily at this point, but I think about that and think about the woman who developed technology that recreates the dead from your text messages and whatever you upload into it. Would I feel violated if someone did that with me? But I spent a lot of days sending email messages. I've been communicating with people. People can get a pretty good picture of at least my professional life from that. But yet I don't stop doing that, even though I know that's out there. But would I be happy if that were done? I'd really want to be involved in that conversation of that maybe happening.
I think for me, it would depend on what the trade-off was. Like if you were, what sort of convenience you were giving me in exchange for having my voice. So I would like to say that I wouldn't do it. But if it was, a really awesome trade-off, I might, especially considering that you could probably, if somebody wanted to imitate my voice, there's probably enough videos of my lectures or whatever on YouTube that they could probably do that now anyway, if they really wanted to. So like that, there's some data that's out there already. Yeah, I think it would depend what the trade-off would be, but I guess I don't have one specific thing that I keep private that my peers don't. I'm probably, given that I have a smart home and I'm an early adopter, I'd say when it comes to certain things, I probably give away more information than
But I think, Anna, that depends on the context, because I'm now totally addicted to Clubhouse, right? And in Clubhouse, your voice is you, right? And there are brands that are already thinking about voices, right? So I don't know, maybe your perception of voice now and with these social media, new networks based on voice, I don't know. I think that you may change if you start using Clubhouse like crazy.
Anna, are you on Clubhouse? I'm not on Clubhouse.
I'm super addicted. It's just amazing.
Oh, can you tell the audience what that is? Because not everyone's part of the tech Illuminati, and so not everyone will know.
Just to give you a sense, Friday night, somebody opens a room, and in Clubhouse, you're by invite, right? And then you go, it's like a radio format, but there are rooms, and somebody like Matt opens a room. There was a room called Neuromodulation in Alzheimer's, and I'm like, wow. And then you get into the room, and there are like 2 moderators that open the room. And then if you raise your hand or they know you, you become a speaker. So it's like listening to the radio, but with the chance to speak. And we end up being 450 people from all over the world talking about neuromodulation and Alzheimer's on a Friday night. Just amazing. And then you find these really cool people. And I think it's because it's the beginning. Maybe, the more people come, the less quality, but you just share rooms with amazing people and jump from room to room, and you can be doing your dishes and just listening or walking or whatever. And voice, Anna, is so important, because when journalists are in Clubhouse and they run a room, you can tell by their voices, right, that they are super professional, right? So brands are starting to think that they should have voices to represent them in Clubhouse.
I had a colleague who worked with voice as data to help predict disease and actually recently sold his company. And he had talked with us a little bit about the interesting how it varied from state to state, how you owned your voice data. Like if you were leaving a message on someone else's phone and somebody was in the background, would you own it or would you have to ask that person for permission? And that wasn't uniform across the states. So running a company where you're collecting voice data and trying to do that kind of work is not as simple.
There's another topic with brain data that I'm curious to get your opinions on, if you have one, and that's the kind of trend of medicalizing the human experience. There's been this greater appreciation recently of cognitive diversity, but I think that there's a tension between, if I take something like ADHD, on one hand, I think there would be a lot of neurologists and neuroscientists that would be skeptical of that label and see attention as a kind of spectrum, a natural spectrum. And then on the other hand, I think there are advocates for people for whom attention deficit is a kind of disability in the learning environment, who want to make sure that there's a label that can be applied to get particularly children extra time taking tests. And there's been this whole ecosystem that's arisen out of there. All of that is based on just kind of behavioral assessment of people and trying to bin them at a behavioral level. What happens when we start having greater access to brain data and we start correlating brain data with those labels and start developing new labels based on kind of diagnostic technology and even just consumer technology? What direction do we think that will push this? Do we have any kind of predictions?
I would say that's the medicalization piece, or the blurred line between health and wellness, is something that I'm really worried about, actually. Mainly in the sense of, I worry about the quantified self movement and the way that's pervaded so many things, that everything about you can be quantified with a metric that will start diminishing a richer perception of an experience. And part of that is going to be thinking about what cognitive diversity looks like, because I feel like there's so many ways that that's already constrained by social norms also. And anyway, and many people don't benefit from that. Many people are actually disenfranchised from that. I think that technology can be a positive tool, in helping predict diseases and thinking about how to intervene early, but it also requires a lot of care in making sure you're not boxing someone in and forecasting a future that they don't have a part in.
I would say that my concern in the near term is more based on the validity of those metrics, just because looking at the direct-to-consumer space, there are a lot of products that are marketed to consumers that claim to be able to have some measure of engagement or attention, but how they're actually extrapolating that from the EEG is a definite black box. And so I'm concerned that, at least in this near-term space, right, that they're being sold to consumers, but they're not actually accurate. measures of attention. And then, looking a little bit ahead into the future, if these tools do get taken up in, let's say, workplace settings or school settings, right? I have concerns about how those measures will be used. And underneath that all is still a question about whether they're valid and what we're extrapolating them. So those are like the concerns for me that are out there now with regard to those kind of measures.
To me as an entrepreneur, I think I'll take it one step at a time, because it's impossible to so when I do an EEG biomarker for epilepsy or for my depression trial or whatever, I'll be asking myself, these ethical questions and making sure, that the data cannot be used in another way. But honestly, we are not yet there. So I think we have to think about it, but there's no correlations I can extract right now. And I need massive amounts of data that I don't have yet and I need to go through the FDA to validate that that's, a diagnostic tool. And so, honestly, I think that we need to apply some of these questions and principles on our daily life, but I cannot get that crazy because, until I don't see clear signs that I can get meaningful data from these patients and subjects in my study, which I cannot right now, right? I just have to make sure that they consent the data, that I make good use of the data that is identified and so on and so forth, and protect the patients. It's their data, right?
Yeah, I think it's about grounding it in the science of what we can actually understand, maximizing transparency, and having a clear vision of what is going to be done with these biomarkers or outcomes or results.
Stephanie, Anna, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Matt. We had a great time.
Let's do one in Clubhouse. Let's do a neuroethics in Clubhouse. Why not? Come on, I invite you all.
I think we should.
I will. I promise.
Okay. We'll do it.
Thanks, Matt.
Take care.
This was fun.
Bye.